I want to say good evening to our audience here in person and those that are on Facebook Live as well, watching the program. My name is John Dugan. I have the pleasure of serving here as the State Archivist in the Secretary of State's office. And we want to particularly thank our Friends Group for the support of these fine programs that we have. We would love for you to go and become a Friends member. You can go to their website, www.friendsofmsa.org. There's brochures back on the table back here, and I think some of their magazines back there as well if you don't get those in the mail. But we also want to, this evening, encourage you to come back on September the 18th, also at 7 o'clock. That's on Thursday night. Our next program will be D.M. Giangreco's presentation on President Truman's role in the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, something that I've not heard anything about before. He will shed light on the spring of 1945, highlighting projects Milepost and Hula, as well as Keel Block is another operation, the planning for that. And he will discuss how it came to be that these secret U.S. initiatives have remained off the radar screens of both historians and World War II history buffs for decades. But tonight we're thrilled to have with us Chris Naffziger. He's a historian who studies the built environment of the city of St. Louis. For those that may not know, built environment is buildings. So he chronicles explorations and studies with his blog, St. Louis Patina. And if you don't follow that, I would recommend that as well. There's always good articles out there on that. He also writes about the history of German-American brewers in the city with a particular emphasis on Lemp, and he has a book back here that you can purchase from him after the program, and the Anheuser-Busch families. He also writes for St. Louis Magazine, and as I just said, he has a recent book on the Lemp and Western breweries. So tonight I would love for you to give a round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everyone who's come here tonight. I know there's many other things you could be doing tonight, and you took the time to come and hear me speak so much. Can everyone hear me correctly, or all right? A little bit louder? Okay, I'll get closer. How about now? Is that good? Okay, I'll make sure. Okay, maybe put my, okay, how's that? Really good? Everybody's good, including the back? Okay, great. I see lots of thumbs up. I also wanted to thank everybody, all the employees of the Missouri State Archives. I realized when I was pulling up to the building, I thought to myself, this building looks really familiar. And I realized why it was familiar is because it's on the homepage of a place that I go all the time for research. In particular, for my research for Anheuser-Busch and for the Lemps, I used the probate files, which were digitized several years ago now. Those are amazing. It tells me so much about how the state of Missouri grew. Things just as simple as how much people were paid a day back around the Civil War. It was $1 a day, was a good wage back then. So just really fascinating things that I've learned through all the hard work of the employees of the Missouri State Archives. So thank you again so much. You've done so much work for me, to be honest. So let's take it away. So Anheuser-Busch, obviously everybody in this room has heard of Anheuser-Busch. And the story of Anheuser-Busch, sort of the public story, is really interesting. But what's so much better is that the untold story of Anheuser-Busch is even more interesting. So let's get started. Okay, so first of all, and I was just speaking about this beforehand. So first of all, the George Schneider fallacy, and you're maybe wondering what that's all about. So perhaps maybe you might know that originally Eberhard Anheuser and Adolphus Busch didn't actually own what was known as the Bavarian Brewery. So it's open knowledge, and it's always been publicized by Anheuser-Busch that they purchased a failing and troubled brewery called the Bavarian Brewery. Now, the legend goes, and I'm using the word legend because that's what it was, it turns out, due to my research, that it was founded in 1852. Well, it turns out that the Bavarian Brewery was not founded by George Schneider in 1852. He was actually embroiled in a failing brewery called the Washington Brewery that was founded in 1852. It turns out that in reality, there was a man named George Hammer, or Adam Hammer, he founded the Bavarian Brewery in 1857. And how do we know that? Well, due to files that were actually here in the state archives, and also in probate files that were scanned and put online here at this very building. So, it's very, very interesting. But wait a minute, it says everywhere online that it was 1852. The internet's always right, correct? So, guess what? I dug deeper. I went to the Recorder of Deeds at St. Louis City Hall, and it turns out there's all sorts of deeds recorded, basically chronicling how George Schneider, the supposed founder of Anheuser-Busch, the Bavarian Brewery, wasn't involved in the Bavarian Brewery at all. I think how the myth began is that at one point after the Washington Brewery, which George Schneider did actually found, went out of business, he actually worked as a contract brewer or brewmaster for 1 year. So I think that's how it kind of got extrapolated that supposedly the Bavarian Brewery started in 1852. But there's in fact all sorts of, and this is another example right here, and that famous book, St. Louis Brews, it says the same thing, right? So it has to be true. So in reality, George Schneider owned this little brewery right down here on the St. Louis Levee, right there, the Washington Brewery. There it is. It was a beer garden. This was it right before it got demolished. That's where that, you all know St. Louis, there's that Round Hotel. That's where that brewery was. And ironically, that Round Hotel is going to be demolished soon, too. And that was the entrance to it. And there was a cave. You all like caves, right? This is the cave state. So German brewers used caves down on the south side of St. Louis to store their beer. Remember, this was German beer, so it was lager beer. Lager beer had to have really cold temperatures in order for the yeast to work. So the Lemps, the Stumpfs, the Schneiders, they all had their own breweries that had caves. And this cave in particular, actually he named it Cave Street, so it'd make it nice and easy for us to find out where his cave was. Now, this was where, like other researchers, they were so close to getting it right, and they fumbled. They thought that George Schneider trucked his beer up the hill to this cave. It's like, no, his cave was actually where the brewery was, and he never was part of Anheuser-Busch. And here was his actual brewery. I know it's not a very good photo, but it was basically there until the 1930s. And the brewery went down 3 stories. How do I know that? Because there was a mechanics lien because he didn't pay the builder. And it described a 6-story brewery. But as you can see here, there's only 3 stories above ground. So we know that there were 3 stories below ground. And that's where the cave was. And later on, they claimed that this was the original Bavarian brewery. It wasn't. They described this building down on Broadway. That wasn't it. So the real Bavarian brewery was found by this very infamous Dr. Adam Hammer from Germany. He came to America in 1848, approximately. There were all sorts of revolutions in Germany at that time, throughout Europe, in fact, France, Hungary, Italy. And many of these revolutionaries actually came to Missouri. Maybe you all know that story about these German radicals coming here to Missouri and becoming what we call radical Republicans. Dr. Adam Hammer was one of them. He actually founded a medical school based off of German medicine. At the time in St. Louis, when he arrived in St. Louis, to become a doctor, it was a 3-month training course. Dr. Hammer revolutionized medical training in St. Louis by expanding the training to become a doctor by stretching it out to 1.5 years. How's that for extensive training to become a doctor? He also was an ophthalmologist, and he actually had eye surgery. He performed eye surgeries right there in St. Louis. He actually also did it free of charge. He was actually very much sort of a humanist here in St. Louis. And He was quite the character, though. He was infamous for his temper. So while he was simultaneously helping all these people, providing free medical care to indigent people in St. Louis, he also was irritating people in the German-American community. There's famous stories of him wanting to become members of an orchestra, but people getting so sick of him that they actually all quit the orchestra, for example. So it's a very interesting figure. But at the same time, he was fighting for abolition in St. Louis. During the Civil War, he actually became a surgeon in the Union Army. He actually worked right there in St. Louis. So here's a picture of him. It was a wonderful photograph. It was actually very common. You might be wondering, how did an ophthalmologist become a brewery owner? And it was actually very common for the economy of St. Louis before the Civil War was just exploding in size. And consequently, everybody was just sort of doing all sorts of venture capitalism, for lack of a better way of describing it. These men were young, too. They were in their 20s and 30s. Many of them were in their 20s, actually. And they were making tremendous amounts of money. Tens of thousands of dollars, which was a huge amount of money back then. Remember, skilled laborers back then were making $1 a day, and there were men in their early 20s making $50,000, $60,000. It was a lot of money back then in St. Louis. So, like I said, now I wouldn't say that it was just good enough that I had one newspaper article that said it was founded in 1857. I have a lot more evidence. But like I said, you can see right here in this newspaper article, it says, Bavarian Brewery, Dr. Hammer and Company, proprietors, established in 1857. It doesn't say 1852, does it? But like I said, I have other evidence. Other evidence is that, for example, there is no documentation of the Bavarian Brewery existing before that. There's other documents, for example, scanned into probate files that said that basically the Bavarian Brewery was founded in 1857. No mention of George Schneider. George Schneider did work as a brewmaster for 1 year, and he got fired, most likely because he was starting to pretend like it was his own brewery. And Dr. Hammer probably got tired of him basically being too big for his britches, as we say. And it's actually kind of, I don't want to accuse anybody of anything, but it's actually kind of shady how Eberhard Anheuser ended up with the brewery. In 1860, Eberhard Anheuser and about 7 other investors all invested money into the Bavarian Brewery. And there's a deed recorded in the Recorder of Deeds office at St. Louis. Back then, people didn't take loans out in banks. They borrowed money from each other. Remember, everybody had huge amounts of money back then that were in business. And Eberhard Anheuser was just one of 7 different investors, and he wasn't even the biggest investor. But guess how long it took for Dr. Hammer to default on his loan? Like 3 months. So, really? That seems kind of strange, doesn't it? And so it went to, literally, they went to the courthouse steps to auction it off. And Eberhard Anheuser was one of 3 investors who bought the brewery out of insolvency. So basically, Eberhard Anheuser only invested, a little bit of money. Dr. Hammer defaults on the loan. Next thing, Eberhard Anheuser is picking up this brewery for just a small amount of money. Pretty good deal. Does anyone know what was Eberhard Anheuser actually famous for? Soap manufacturing. It's actually really interesting. Soap manufacturing was a huge business back in the 19th century. So the Bavarian Brewery was actually just about $20,000 worth of capital. The soap factory was $200,000 in capital. So the amount of money that Eberhard Anheuser had to spend was the equivalent of just like, a couple weeks worth of income in his soap factory. So it was it was basically a very small investment. So that's the real story. And you all know, of course, who did he get to run this brewery that he bought out of bankruptcy? His son-in-law, right? Adolphus Busch. Adolphus Busch is very famous. This is actually probably the earliest photograph we have, and you all know what a calling card is, right? Calling cards are wonderful. When you'd show up at somebody's house and they weren't home, you would give them your calling card, and it had your name on it and it had your photograph. It's actually really smart because then the person who you were visiting doesn't have to wonder who the heck it was that came and visited your house because you have a photograph of the person. They're wonderful documentation of what people looked at certain times. And this is him when he was extremely young, basically right before he took over the brewery. Eberhard Anheuser then, he basically had a tiny investment in this brewery. No brewery in St. Louis was anywhere close to as big as many other industries, such as soap making. Okay, there you go. So, we all know, you've all seen what Anheuser-Busch looks nowadays, even if you've never visited St. Louis. They feature those iconic buildings in all of their advertising, right? Now, those buildings date from the 1880s and 1890s up into the 20th century. It's actually very fascinating. The original Bavarian brewery, Anheuser-Busch buildings, are actually much more humble. The Lemp Brewery, which is the brewery that I wrote about in my book, they were light years ahead of Anheuser-Busch. Anheuser-Busch was not even in the top 10 largest breweries. So here is a picture. This is actually one of the earliest depictions of the Bavarian brewery. The building on the left, that is the original brewery, very humble. In fact, you'll love this story. Their caves, now remember, Lemp is very famous for their caves. It still exists. However, the caves of the Bavarian brewery were actually so poorly buttressed and constructed that they actually collapsed on one of the brewmasters that Dr. Hammer actually employed. This brewmaster actually fled his job because he would go down in the caves and the ceiling would collapse on him. So consequently, Dr. Hammer and his brothers actually sued this brewmaster for breach of contract. They lost, however, because the Supreme Court of Missouri ruled that you are not responsible for fulfilling a contract if it risks your life. So there's no famous caves at the Anheuser-Busch brewery. They actually had to dig them themselves because the one they did have basically collapsed on people. So very interesting. I've tried so many times to try to see the cellars in Anheuser-Busch, but they're closed to the public. So it's a very humble affair, is how you describe the early Bavarian brewery. It's interesting. It's the largest brewery in the world now, and it once started out of failure, right? So, of course, you all know that Lily Anheuser married Adolphus Busch. Of course, she was the daughter of Eberhard, and basically a marriage sealed the deal with basically Adolphus Busch operating the brewery. For Eberhard Anheuser, this was basically just a very small investment. He's like, well, why don't I give my son-in-law something to do? Let's see if he can do something with this small brewery I bought. He could have had him run the soap factory, but he had him run the little brewery. I think you all know as well, Adolphus was like the 21st of like 22 children or something like that. And there were actually a lot of other Busch family members in St. Louis. There actually was another Busch brewery in St. Louis. It was actually larger than the Bavarian brewery. So Adolphus was actually kind of, not really very important in the grand scheme of things. In Herman, there was actually another Busch brewery as well. And here's some of his family members, brothers. Here's one of the houses. Like I said, there were bushes all over the place. When you had over 20 children, you just had them all over the place. And here's just some of their houses. They had very nice houses. They were doing very well. And here is a depiction. I think, obviously, quality, it is very consistent beer. Making such large amounts of beer consistently the same all of the time is the secret to their success, right? But also advertising. And I think something I really want to hammer home to all of you all is that they started very early with really excellent advertising. Same with the Lemps, same with the Falstaff Brewing Company. St. Louis breweries have always been masters of advertising. This is a really special piece of advertising. It's actually on metal. And it's one of the first depictions of, for one thing, their cellars on the left, their bottling department on the right, and on the top you can actually see, again, you can see the brewery plant. In the back, do you see those pyramid-shaped structures? Those are kilns. One of the most important things to do in the brewing process is to dry out the ingredients. And those kilns were a critical part of the brewing process. Bottling, every single bottle had to be corked by one. Wine, of course, is still corked, right? Up until the invention of the bottle cap, that's what you had to do, is you had to cork every single one of your beer bottles. A lot of manual labor, to say the least. And I don't know if you're all familiar with something known as Compton and Dry's Pictorial St. Louis. It was published in 1875 and released in 1876. And it shows what the brewery looked like. And you can see on the right there, already by the 1860s, they had built a new brew house. And they were very practical, these Germans. They didn't want to have any of their construction ever interfere with production. So the first brew house was on the left, and then they built the new brew house on the right. So the brew house on the left could hum along in production while they built a new, better, more modern brew house on the right. And if you're a lover of Budweiser beer, that building on the right is where Budweiser was first brewed in America. So later on, we'll see they'll build a new brew house, and they'll build it on the left after they demolish the building on the left, while the brew house on the right continues to hum along. Very ingenious, very, very practical. We also have Whipple fire insurance maps, and these are also just wealth of information. Guess what? It shows us every single building in the 1870s, and every single building is labeled. So we know what every single building was for. So we can see the brew houses there in the middle. We can see the office. We can see the ice houses. We can see the malt kilns in the background. Did you know they actually had barges, the Lemp family as well, and Anheuser-Busch did as well? They would travel all the way up to north central Illinois to collect ice from a town called Depew and bring it by barge all the way down to the St. Louis riverfront, if you can believe that. Now, later on, St. Louis breweries such as Lemp and Anheuser-Busch pioneered the creation of artificial ice. It was very ingenious. They were always at the forefront of new technology, such as refrigeration. That will be in a little bit. We'll get to refrigeration in just a second. And like I said, something that was very important to these brewers is they emphasized how amazing and modern their breweries were. And this was common through all industries, whether you had a soap factory, whether or not you had, like, say, a power plant. You always had a picture of your modern installation because you wanted to show off how modern and at the forefront of new technology. Now, you also, in advertising, had the opportunity to make stuff up. If you've ever been to the Anheuser-Busch brewery, you all know, of course, that the river isn't that close to the brewery, right? But for dramatic effect, you can see, what do you see? You see the barges right there with the ice arriving from Depew, Illinois, right? So, they can have a little bit of fun with the advertising. And, you can see their houses in the background. Something that was very important is that the brewers always lived close to their brewery. They always wanted to show that they had confidence in what they produced. Now they were really starting to grow. The malt kiln, that huge structure towering over in the background, that was just showing how much larger. This is now getting into 1870s. And what do you notice there on the left? You see that the original brew house has been demolished and replaced with a brand new state-of-the-art brew house. And this is very important to realize now that there are German-American architects who are starting to specialize in both engineering and architecture at the same time. And Anheuser-Busch had a very important architect named Edmund Jungenfeld. He was trained in Germany, and he basically had the philosophy that went along with the same idea of advertising, that they combined both beauty with functionality. And there's a big fancy German word called the Rundbogenstil, which means round arch style, which basically was sort of a combination of the Romanesque revival and Renaissance architecture. At the same time this was all happening, Germany was uniting in 1871 in the aftermath of the Franco-Prussian War. I don't know how familiar you are with European history. Consequently, at the same time as Germany was uniting into the German Empire, underneath Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany. At the same time, these breweries were exploding in size. And consequently, they wanted to project this very muscular German image. And the Romanesque style was seen by German nationalists as a very particular, very distinctive German style that was not French, to put it in simple terms. Let's just say that. France was seen as sort of the eternal enemy of German nationalism. And that way, with this style of architecture, was showing a very German attitude, we might say. So Jungenfeld is of incredible importance. Later on, he would have a series of other architects working underneath him that would design pretty much most of the buildings on this campus. But it's interesting to point out, basically everything you see in this photograph at the height of this expanding, rapid growth, is basically all gone, except for that building in the foreground. So here is that third brew house. And again, the Germans were very smart in that you tried to provide as much product as possible that was free. So big windows, tall buildings, and so big windows give you free light. Tall buildings provide you with free gravity. So you just have to get things up to the top of the building, and then gravity just gives you free movement downward. So the brewing starts up at the top, and then everything just drains down through pipes, down all the way down to the bottom into the cellars. Now, obviously, you have to get it up out of the cellars, right? And that's through pneumatic pumps, and that's a term we call racking. And they actually used pumps that would pump the beer up through pipes out of the cellars. They didn't put them into barrels and then hoist the barrels out anymore. That's what they did back in the day when they were using caves out in the country. The amount of manual labor that people were doing back in the 19th century is just astounding compared to nowadays what we do with machines. And there was even a plaque. I mean, this relationship between architects and brewers was very strong. They actually had a plaque dedicated to their architect on the wall. It has disappeared. The archivist for Anheuser-Busch says they don't have any idea where this has gone. This is kind of a smoky photograph, but I wanted to show it to you because what do you see there? You see their rail cars. St. Louis was never the biggest beer market in America. Obviously, places like New York, Brooklyn were bigger. But St. Louis was the last major city before you went out west. So Lemp and Anheuser-Busch realized that they had a huge market out there that they could capitalize on. Refrigerated rail cars were an invention, and everybody argues. I'm not going to get into that argument about whether or not Lemp or Anheuser-Busch invented them. To put it bluntly, they both came up with it about the same time. And that's why they needed artificial ice, because they refrigerated these cars with ice. Eventually, obviously, they had motors that refrigerated them, but that would be coming later. What did they need all along their train tracks? They needed ice houses. So soon, these breweries were having to create these massive infrastructures throughout the American West that would keep these cars cold. And they needed to stop and drop blocks of ice into these rail cars every so often. The amount of engineering, the amount of logistics that were required was massive. Here's just another photograph. You can get an idea of the rail cars. And of course, everybody had to provide their own power back then. So they had their own boiler houses as well. And here's a photograph of the bottling house. As you can see, they have barrels of beer in front of them, and each person had to basically fill each bottle by themselves, and they had a special bench that basically pushed the cork into each bottle. You might think that is actually kind of a bad thing, right? But Anheuser-Busch saw that as an opportunity. What did they give out by the hundreds of thousands, if not millions? Bottle openers, cork screws that had the Anheuser-Busch name on it. So it was free advertising with their cork screws. And that doesn't maybe show up as much, but this was the malt house where they ground up all of the materials, all of the ingredients. It's actually empty nowadays. Anheuser-Busch actually prepares their malt at central locations nowadays and just sends it out to the different breweries. More efficient, obviously. The offices were famous for being very clean and very, beautiful, all sorts of different types of wood. One of the offices actually had very dark wood interlaid, so it was actually striped. They had spittoons everywhere, so there would be no tobacco juice on the floors. Everything was immaculately clean. Remember, they always were dealing with, the temperance movement, and one thing that they always wanted to project was the idea that beer was sanitary, it was clean, it was non-intoxicating, was the message they always gave, is that you couldn't get drunk off of beer. I found, this was great, it was like a high school yearbook or something. I actually found an advertisement for Anheuser-Busch in the back of this yearbook. And there was a whole paragraph about how this woman had gone everywhere in the Anheuser-Busch brewery, and she couldn't find a single drunk worker anywhere in the Anheuser-Busch brewery. And she was very impressed by that. And somehow it ended up in the back of a high school yearbook. Anyway, non-intoxicating. Oh, pardon me. And again, the cellars, remember, of course, it's dramatic effect. They didn't actually roll those, maybe they were replacing a broken one, I don't know, but they didn't actually roll those barrels in and out like that. They would have had pipes going in, but of course, having a bunch of pipes going in and out maybe didn't look as romantic. So, it actually was very dangerous. Do you know what gas built up in here? Carbon dioxide from the fermentation, and so it was actually very dangerous. One of the Lemp's sons, Louis Lemp, actually wrote about the dangers of carbon dioxide building up in the lower levels because carbon dioxide is heavier, and so you had to be very careful in these cellars that there was too much carbon dioxide. It usually sank low enough that if you were like my height, you didn't have to worry about it, but that was a danger in these cellars about carbon dioxide building up. So that brings us, of course, to the famous brew house. What did they do? They demolished the one on the right, correct? Because they kept brewing away on the left. This is where it gets interesting. There are 2 different dates on this building. But I always joke about studying American architecture. It's nice and easy because you just look at the cornerstone and it has the date of when it was built, right? Well, you can't do that with, I used to study Renaissance architecture and they don't have cornerstones with the date on them back then. Well, one side of this building says 1892, the other side says 1893. And there were building permits back then, but it doesn't clear it up exactly. However, this represents a moment where, basically they brew beer in other parts there, but they didn't build any more brew houses after this. The one on the left, was partially disassembled and kind of like just the front facade of it survives as a test brewery. It's where young up-and-coming brewers learn their craft. They come from around the United States. This was designed by the firm of Widman, Walsh, and Boisselier. 3 men who basically were in charge of designing pretty much all of the brewery buildings up until basically their firm dissolved because they passed away. But very interestingly, they were not originally the firm of Widman, Walsh, and Boisselier. They actually were Jungenfeld and Company. They were the acolytes of Edmund Jungenfeld. And even after he died, they actually called themselves Jungenfeld and Company. However, after a little while, they went ahead and started calling themselves by their actual last names. But they were very much the successors of a very strong German tradition. One of them was a German. I think one of them was French-American. The other one was Irish-American. So I just used some photographs. You can get an idea. I mean, they started building it's really helpful. You can kind of date photographs by counting the number of smokestacks in the power plant. There's 3 of them. And so there's only 1 smokestack in the boiler house as they have it labeled. So we know that it's, late 19th century. And as you can see, it's starting to grow really fast. They had massive amounts of buildings. Everything's labeled. That's really great. I love how breweries always label their buildings. It makes it really easy for our jobs as well. Again, just kind of let you see some historic photographs that usually aren't very easy to see. The chandeliers, of course, very famously came from the World's Fair in 1904. A little bit of a side note, you obviously know there, if you've ever been on the tour, there's those giant copper and steel brew kettles. Do you guys know how they get those into the building when they have to replace them every 20 or 30 years? Through the skylight with a giant crane. Can the crane operator see what he's doing? No. A person inside of the building has to talk to the crane operator with a walkie-talkie and guide him down so they can install them. So how's that for a lot of work? Just a photograph of some of the brewers and their workers. You know, it's actually really interesting. Back in the early days of German brewing, a lot of the brewers were bachelors, and they all just simply lived in the brewery in dormitories. It's actually something that a lot of people don't realize. And I think this is the bottling and packing, which look how small it is compared to eventually the Bevo bottling plant. Just some more photographs. You also might notice the appearance of women working there as well. This is the painting, paint shop. The legend goes is that the English and French American business interests and banking interests in St. Louis didn't like the Germans, so Adolphus Busch has simply started his own bank, is the story. And they actually still have a credit union, which actually I'm a member of. It's where I bank, is actually the old Anheuser-Busch Employees Credit Union. This is just, again, there's so many resources to study these buildings. Fire insurance maps, which is what insurance adjusters used to determine how much you have to pay for fire insurance. It shows us basically what all these buildings look like. You can count the number of boilers in the boiler house. Those black squares represent one boiler. There's so many resources out there that we can use. Here's just another example. Here are the rail yards, massive, substantially shrunk nowadays. The Bevo bottling plant was famous for having dozens of railroad tracks going into it. Most of them have been converted to tractor trailer docks, obviously. Shipping office, no building did not have extensive ornamentation, part of their branding. Just some more of those rail cars. Perfect example, you all know the famous stories about during Prohibition, right, where they produced what was called malt nutrine. One time I gave a lecture at a nursing home, and there was a woman there who was close to 100 years old. She told me she remembered her parents and their friends celebrating the end of Prohibition. They were celebrating, they all went out and bought beer. But malt nutrine was something that they used to kind of get through Prohibition. Yeah. You guys, all the stories, right? They basically, Gussie Busch admitted that they basically were just bootlegger suppliers during Prohibition. And they couldn't prove it, right? I mean, you were just selling yeast and stuff like that. And of course, it was all organized and directed out of the Lions Schoolhouse. Some of the Busch family actually went to school in the Lions Schoolhouse. But then at one point, the Board of Education, realized that this school was completely surrounded by the brewery, so they went ahead and just sold the building to Anheuser-Busch, and they moved their offices into it. It actually is an incredibly important relic. It is the oldest St. Louis public school building that still survives. Anheuser-Busch has preserved it. I'm showing you this picture because this is the back. You can see the malt kiln. But I want you to turn your attention to the lower right. You see there's a garden. And I want you to remember that. Because that brings us to the mansion. And I'm sure you're thinking, oh, you mean Grant's Farm, right? No. I'm talking about number 1 Busch Place. which is the current address of the office building for Anheuser-Busch. But in reality, that was the mansion where Adolphus Busch lived with his family. He never lived at Grant's farm. That was a gift to August Busch I. The mansion was right by the brewery, and there was a big net, and we'll go back for a second. You see that net right there? That was to keep junk from the brewery smokestacks from coming into the garden. So it was originally Eberhard Anheuser's Italianate country villa, and then it got a really, really big addition onto it, which you can see right there. So you can see on the right there, do you see there's the old house? And then on the left is the giant expansion. This is where people like incredibly important politicians came and were entertained by the Busch family. It was one of the most important addresses in the city of St. Louis, number 1 Busch Place. It was a private drive. And there was number 2 Busch Place, which was where basically his heir, August Busch, lived. These houses were all demolished in the 1930s. And you can see another photograph of the front. Here is the interior, the drawing room where people were entertained. So those stables that you go to when you go on the brewery tour, those were not for brewery horses. That was the stable for the mansion. That's where they kept all of the horses. And something that a lot of people don't realize is there was an entertainment room. When wealthy people came to visit the Busches, their drivers needed a place to hang out, right? So there was actually a room where their servants could go and play cards and basically stay warm while their employers were inside the mansion having fun with the Busch family. Yeah, that was not actually for work horses. That was for, carriage horses. Here's just some nice photographs. They were extremely wealthy. Let's just put it that way. There you go. Here he is getting older. This is a great photograph. This is very close to when they passed away. You can see that actually in their carriage right out in front of the mansion. And very famously, have any of you all seen their very famous mausoleum in Bellefontaine Cemetery? It's famous for being, I think it was $50,000 or $40,000 when it was first built. That was a huge amount of money back then. Pink Missouri granite, probably from around Elephant Rock State Park area down in Iron County. Just, absolutely amazing. What's that? You've been there? It's incredible. Little thing that, a very important myth. Do you see that little thing sitting out in front of the mausoleum? There is a common myth in St. Louis. That is where members of the Busch family come to be baptized with beer. Have you ever heard that? I know the cemetery staff very well. That is 100% not true. That is actually a flower vase. That's actually where members of the family can come and put flowers. They do not baptize their babies with beer at the cemetery. Okay, so that's a very important myth to distill. Okay, all right. So after Adolphus Busch, there is a story after that. So August Busch Sr., you can see him here. So there was an Adolphus Busch the Jr., and there's actually still an Adolphus Busch the Fifth today. But the line of the family members that control the brewery goes over to August. And you can see some of the family. You all heard of Gussie Busch, right? If you're a Cardinals fan, you know who Gussie Busch is, right? Any Cardinals fans here, or are you more Kansas City Royals? Okay. Gussie's very famous, of course, for buying the St. Louis Cardinals to keep them from leaving St. Louis. Even though he wasn't even into baseball, but he basically just did it for St. Louis. So he's beloved in St. Louis. So, and very famously, they did fox hunting and polo, and they bought a big swath of land out in St. Louis County, which was way out in the country at the time. But remember, they owned automobiles. So they had the luxury of being able to live further and further out away from everybody else. So that was a sign of their privilege that they could travel out to the countryside and live in these houses out in the countryside like Grant's Farm because they could afford the technology to get out there easily. And the Lemps and the Griesdijk families, they lived out there as well because they could get out there easily. If it was by carriage, it would have taken too long. They actually paid for the paving of Gravois Road, which is the road that they would take from the brewery out to their mansion at Grant's Farm. So there's just some pictures of them getting ready for polo and stuff like that. Interestingly enough, I don't know how well you knew this, but like it's now too dense around where they used to play polo, and it's a town called Huntleith. They've all moved out further out west to get away from everybody. So they just keep moving further and further out to get away from everybody. So 2 smokestacks. We know it's getting into the 20th century. They bought the Belgian pavilion from the World's Fair, and they turned it into their glassworks. Have you ever heard of vertical integration in business? It's basically when a business produces everything they need for their business. They bought the hops fields in Germany. They made their own glass. They made their own bottles. They did everything. So the Lemps did the same thing. They never quite achieved 100% vertical integration, but they tried to do that to save money. It's been torn down, unfortunately. And of course, the Bevo bottling plant, basically this was built right at the dawn of Prohibition. Basically, it's the Busch family saying that Prohibition's going to end, and we're going to be ready to crush our competitors as soon as it's over. And they did have to lay off half of their employees. Don't ever get the idea that they did swimmingly well during Prohibition. They eked by, but they were ready to go once Prohibition ended. They were correct. The Bevo bottling plant, Klipstein and Rotman were the architects, and everything was just ingeniously built. Had thousands of employees. It's all been mechanized nowadays. That was quite a bone of contention back in the day when that happened. I want you to look in the background. Do you see how that there's conveyor belts that wrap around the columns? Ingenious. Instead of having to pay and construct a way for the crates to come down from another floor, they just simply wrap the conveyor belts around the columns that already have to be there anyway. So we'll kind of go through these fast. There's just a fraction of the number of employees. This is my photograph. They were making Bud Light that day, or bottling, I should say. It's unbelievable to watch. This is up on the roof. This is the back of the letter B. I got to go up on the roof. That was really cool. This is the basement. This is how you get underneath Broadway to get out to the loading docks. I told somebody before it started that this is the day when Prohibition ended. They're all smiling. Gussie Busch is over there on the right. And yes, it's important to realize, you all know, right, by the time that Prohibition ended, they weren't using Clydesdales to deliver beer anymore, right? But it was very ingenious, and still to this day, incredibly effective advertising. So August Busch Jr., Gussie, famous. He did an excellent job. Opened the first Busch brewery outside of St. Louis in Newark. Remember, the Griesdijks had already done that with Falstaff. Before that time, people thought you couldn't brew the same beer in another city. And the Griesdijks proved that was wrong. And then Busch built a whole new, brand new brewery. They never liked banks. So they built it. They always had huge amounts of capital. They built the brewery in Newark with their own money. I know. He lived there. This house was actually damaged by the tornado in May. This was his starter house. This was his house when he was young and getting started. Very famous picture. This is, I think, the 20 millionth barrel. August Busch III is standing over him. He, of course, remember, forces him out of power secretly in the 1970s. With Dick Gephardt. You guys remember? Do you remember Dick Gephardt when he was around here? Basically, August Busch III kind of brought the brewery into the late 20th century. And I'm sure you all know the story. August Busch IV took over the brewery, and they got bought by the Brazilians.